Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining our webinar tonight. And I'm just thrilled to have a really wonderful friend and colleague, Pris Prutzman. She's going to be joining and hosting our webinar for this evening. So let me give you a little bit of information about my friend Pris. So I know Pris way back when from the Association for Conflict Resolution. We did a lot of work together in our Youth Day organization. Pris would lend us her knowledge, her wisdom, and of course her wonderful friendship. And Pris has been in conflict resolution. Pris, since 1974.
Mm-hmm. 72, yeah.
72. And I'm going to let you, Pris, talk more about your organization in just a moment. But Pris is she's been around and she does a lot of work in restorative practices. And she may tell you a little bit about that tonight in her webinar. And I just can't say enough positive things about Pris. Now, Pris, I was trying to get to your bio, but it would not let me get to it for some reason. So I'm sorry for the abbreviated wording, but I'm just going to turn it over to Pris now because I think who better to tell about herself than the great Priscilla Prutzman. So, Pris, I'm turning it over to you, girl.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Well, I really love doing these things, and I'm really happy to be here. I have been working with originally children's creative response to conflict and now creative response to conflict, as Cindy said, since 1972, which is kind of amazing. And I've been doing the bias awareness workshops for many years as well. This model actually goes back to the Mayor Dinkins in the city of New York model. He had a program called the Increase the Peace program. And we, at the time, were mostly a conflict resolution organization, but they very wisely asked us to do this bias awareness. So we developed a 2-day model, which I'll go over in a minute, but just to give a little background about that. But first I wanted to ask everybody to introduce themselves and say what their interest in bias awareness is and what their expectations or what they'd like to get out of this event tonight. So who would like to go first?
I'm happy to jump in and say hello. This is Karen DeVoe. I'm in California. Hi, Pris. Good to see you. Very, very good to see you too. Indeed. So in all of this work with alternative dispute resolution, I think that people come to the work better if they know where they're coming from. So I think for any work that you're doing in unpacking the complexity of conflict, it's important to know your bias and to recognize it when you see it. And also in the work that I do with teacher candidates, this is really important. It's not really well addressed, or it's just not addressed at all. Not even to say well addressed, it's not addressed, and it should be for new teachers that have lots and lots of conflict and bias impacts what they do all the time. So thank you for doing this work with us.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for your for your comments. Cindy or Odine, or is it Odine or Odine?
It's hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, it's Undine.
Undine. Oh, welcome.
Yes.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, I don't think you can see me. It doesn't seem like my computer will allow that, but I've always been interested in any work having to do with bias or racism or discrimination, and I most recently retired after working 31 years as a school psychologist in a public high school in the Midwest. But I became really interested in conflict resolution, particularly in teacher-student conflict. So we piloted some teacher-student mediation techniques, and I wrote a book about it called Restore the Respect, How to Mediate School Conflicts and Keep Students Learning. And that's how Karen and Cynthia reached out to me. So I'm really happy to be here today, and they spoke really highly of you, and I'm excited to hear what you have to teach us today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, and welcome.
Thanks.
Well, I will finish out the three, and I'm sorry, guys, you can't see me tonight, but I have been a little under the weather, so I'm gonna save y'all from from the side. But so I've been doing conflict resolution work since 2005, and I teach a peer mediation to students. And so one of the things that we really talk about is our perceptions and how we see the world through our own lens, and that we think everyone else thinks like we do. And when they don't, we get really upset with them, and then we don't understand, well, why is that? So I really want to add to my toolbox. I want to be able to take this back when I go in June and train my students. I want to add to my bias section, and I want to make it full, and I want to make it encompassing with the wonderful knowledge that Pris is going to bring tonight. So Pris, I'm counting on you, girl.
Thank you so much. Okay, so our bias, the creative response to conflict bias awareness model is really based on a conflict resolution model. So we're using a lot of our themes of cooperation and communication skill building and affirmation, of course, conflict resolution, problem solving, all of the themes that we normally do with conflict resolution. We have incorporated this into our bias awareness work. So we're coming from the perspective of a conflict resolution point of view, okay? And some of the activities that we do in our training are similar, but more focused on bias, of course, to what we would do if we're doing peer mediation training, or if we're doing regular conflict resolution or restorative practice. It's all kind of integrated together. And we also try to integrate bias awareness into all the other themes that we do as well. So we always want to be including bias awareness. And we carefully chose the term bias awareness rather than some of the other terms that are often used, prejudice reduction and that sort of thing, because we felt that everybody's going to be at a different point of view on bias. And we've had a lot of really positive experience in this model with incorporating people who have really, really different points of view. I mean, radically different points of view. There might be people that, for example, feel that being anti-gay is a very positive religious thing. So we talk about that in the workshop itself, and that's an issue that comes up, whether it's transgender, whether it's LGBTQ issues, whether it's anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, whatever the bias. We're really looking at it and listening to it, and what we're trying to do this as much as possible in an atmosphere of safety, so that we do some group building in the beginning, and we're operating on several kind of philosophical assumptions that we all have biases, and that's really freeing up for people, because a lot of times people will come into a diversity work and feel really guilty that they have biases, but we're starting from the premise that everybody has bias, and also that everybody has experienced bias, and those two things kind of create a beginning playing field. Not that there aren't some biases that are really quite serious, like racism and sexism and other biases, Islamophobia. I mean, any bias is if it's directed against you, is a very serious, impactful issue. But we sometimes will look at structural issues, like structural racism might be a harder bias to deal with than some other biases, and that's the kind of thing we encourage people to talk about in an atmosphere of safety. We also encourage, of course, confidentiality, and speaking from an I perspective rather than a you perspective, and along with the restorative philosophy of listening from the heart and speaking from the heart, that often creates a sense of empathy in the group and in the community that we're building. And we're also looking at diversity as being a necessary thing for us, not just something that we kind of like, or that we, of course, we grow from it. But diversity is something that we really want to ing for in every aspect of our life. And it's really kind of an all-encompassing thing when you really look at it, when you really make a commitment. We've done some work with organizations that have struggled to become more diverse, and one of the things we've realized over the years is that you really need to make this a major commitment. It's not something that you can just say you're going to have, but you really need to work at it pretty much all the time, and that's been a problem, I think, in the peace movement, that peace was often more important than diversity. And as soon as we say that diversity is a major goal of ours, then it's amazing how quickly we become a diverse organization, So that's something that we've realized over the years. So the model that we use, we would start out with a cultural globe go around, and we would share what we see as our ethnic background, and or we could talk about our culture. Some people don't actually know what their ethnic background is. So we ask people, if they don't know, to say a culture or a country or an ethnicity that they're very interested in or attracted to. So since we're a very small group here, maybe we could just do that really briefly now, where people could just say, if they know, what their cultural background is. So, I mean, I can start with this and say that both of my parents grew up in a very small town in Pennsylvania, and their ancestry was Pennsylvania Dutch, and they had also some Welsh in their background. And there was always a discussion between my aunt and my mother whether or not there was also English, but it's pretty clear that it was mostly Welsh and German, and coming from pretty much a similar area of Germany on the French border. I had the advantage of going to a peace conference in Germany, in an area that was very, very close to where my ancestors grew up. It was an amazing experience, because I would walk down the street and people would start talking German to me because I looked like I belonged in that town, So that was really good. But we do this kind of culture sharing so that people can get a sense of hearing more about other people's cultures, and also based on an assumption that if you appreciate your own culture, it's more likely that you're going to appreciate other people's cultures, just for the interest in it. So if anyone would like to join in and just share their cultural background, it's always fun for me to do that part. Anyone want to start?
Well, I already unmuted myself. So recently my daughter had her DNA test.
Oh.
So we were always told that we were English, Huguenot, and Seminole.
Oh.
So that was the myth that was handed down in the family. Now the Huguenot and the English, yes. We also have Irish, Iberian Peninsula, and West African. So it was not Seminole Indian. It was told to be Seminole Indian because of the bias in the South against anyone who had African American heritage. So we recently found that out. So I thought that was very interesting.
Oh, that is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, what a interesting story. My story is not very interesting, but I'm from Canada. My parents, both of their backgrounds traced right back to England, Ireland. We also had DNA. We did the 23andMe thing, and it was all, yeah, okay, that's what we thought. It's not. No great stories to tell, but yeah, very, very.
It's all
and
good, Karen. It's all good.
come from long lines of grumpy English people.
Okay, I'll go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Eastern European Jewish. Grandparents on one side were from Poland and Russia, grandparents from the other side from Romania. I grew up with parents in Los Angeles, California, that was very influenced by the Hollywood scene, and there was some anti-Semitism in their era. So they changed their name. They anglicized their name from Grinberg to Greer. So I kind of grew up with having the Jewishness of us kind of homogenized into broader American culture. So we celebrated Easter and Christmas and things in a non-secular kind of way. And then when I became older, I ended up marrying a Jewish man, and so kind of rekindled roots and knowledge about, you know, what it means to be Jewish. But I think my culture is also very influenced by the era of Los Angeles and the, you know, I was born in 1955, so Los Angeles sort of in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and I'm actually in LA now visiting my 88-year-old mother because I now live in the Midwest. But it's also interesting how much the city had shaped me back then.
Yeah. So see, it's how these stories are so interesting, and they usually relate to some kind of bias, like name changes that I mean, that's a really big issue, and people sometimes will say, well, I'm really part of a peace culture or a women's culture or a gay culture, or they might refer to more religion and that being really the culture, or many different approaches. And so after we do this go around, I usually bring a Hug-a-Planet along and pass the Hug-a-Planet along around. And when we do this with young people, they often will look on the globe where their country of origin, if they know it, is, and kind of point to it. And then also the issue of adoption often comes up, where people don't exactly know what their cultural background is, and it's less and less so now with the 23andMe. People are more so doing that, and also the issue of people usually say their name, and the issue of women often taking their husband's name, and what does that mean culturally too. So that's a really significant bias issue as well. So that's the first thing we would do, and then we often would do a activity. I'm sure many of you know the concentric circles activity, where we would ask some basic questions like things you like to do, and then we would get into more diversity oriented questions like, is there a place you would like to visit, even if you've been there many times? Is there a language that you speak or you would like to learn? What do you think causes? Sometimes we'll ask what their communication style is. Do they like to speak, or do they like to listen, or do they tend to observe more? And then we'll ask often what their conflict resolution style is. Do they tend to like to get into conflict? Do they tend to like to avoid conflict? Or are they interested in problem solving? And then we'll usually end the concentric circles with a question like, what do you think causes bias in the world? And then we'll go into a culture web and just brainstorm what people mean by culture, and then we'll break into small groups, and then we will say what part of your culture you most identify with, or you'd like to talk about today. What do you like about that culture, and is there anything that you find difficult about that culture? And that's also a very, very interesting thing. If we have it, depending on the size of the group and the amount of time we have, we might do that in groups of 3 or 4 or even 5 if we have enough time, or if it's a very, very large group. So that's the cultural sharing. And then we usually brainstorm isms. And by isms, we mean power plus the prejudice equals the isms. So what are some sample isms that you think would come up in this context?
Racism, for sure.
Racism always comes up, and that's actually the one that people most want to work on.
Mm-hmm.
What else?
Sexism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What else?
Ageism.
What was the last one?
Classism.
Classism, yeah, also a big one. Uh-huh.
And ageism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are the ones that people often will come up with first, and then we kind of think a little bit more, and other isms come up. Anti-Semitism or religious bias comes up. Islamophobia, homophobia, and sometimes people will come up with different versions of classism. Like sometimes young people will actually use the term sneakerism, a bias, a bias that young people have against somebody's sneakers because they're not the latest, variety. Or sometimes the word clothesism comes up, or looksism, and these are. They sound a little frivolous in some ways to adults, but for young people, that's a really big thing, And so then we will use a process where we'll go over all the different biases that the group has brainstormed, trying to remember to mention the major biases that people have maybe forgot to mention. And then we'll do a consensus process where people can choose which bias they're most interested in. So the way we do that is we have people raising their hands 3 times for the whole list. So then we'll have numerically which ones are the most positive in the sense of working on them for the group. So it's sort of a numerical consensus. Then we'll do a second quick go around. Which one do you want to, of all of these, which is most important? And usually racism comes up, although sometimes classism does. Sometimes languageism comes up too. There's a lot of areas where there's a lot of bias against immigrants, against language, accents, that sort of thing. So sometimes that comes up. So then we will pick one just to model the example where we'll put on the board personal, cultural, and institutional. And then we'll ask people to brainstorm what are personal examples of that bias that they chose. So if they chose racism, an example of a personal bias might be a racial slur or a personal assumption about a person of color. And then we will look at cultural, and cultural is often has to do with stereotypes about a group. So a cultural example for racism might be a young person of color goes into a store and they're kind of followed around the store, a cultural bias. And then institutional would be a bias that's related to any institution. So for racism, institutional racism would be the number of people of color in prisons, for example. That's probably one of the biggest examples of racism. Differences in salary, differences in career paths. There's so many institutional biases for racism. It's quite extensive, actually. So then we would continue on and ask the group to brainstorm other examples. So I just ask you right now, are there other examples that come to mind for you for either personal, cultural, or institutional racism? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I was thinking about college admissions for
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that would be institutional. Mm-hmm.
I can think of, young girls who walk down the street and guys do the cat calls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be an example of cultural sexism, not so much racism, but it would be.
Oh, sorry, I apologize.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I mean, that actually happens quite often in a group, and sometimes the examples overlap. You know, particularly with racism and classism.
Yeah.
You know, but that's a great example of cultural sexism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, in schools, there's a lot of data showing suspension rates, and I guess that's sort of like institutionalized criminal justice, if you like, in a school. You know, that there are more students that are sent to the office, that are suspended, that are expelled. Students of color,
oh yes,
proportionately, in trouble at school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great example of institutionalized racism, the institution being the school. Yeah, and if you were to go back to sexism, as if we were to work on that one, boys being called on more than girls is often an example of a cultural sexism. So that then we would kind of look at that list, and then we would ask the group to get into to look back at the brainstormed list of isms, and they could choose which group they would go to, so that if they went to a group on religious bias or anti-Semitism or classism or homophobia or ageism or languageism, then they would go through the process. And the groups could be different sizes. They could be 2 or 3 people, or there could be 10 people working on whatever ism they wanted to work on. Then they would collectively come up with a list of personal, cultural, and institutional forms of that ism that they were working on. And they would put that on newsprint or on the board, and then they would come back to the group and report back. And then there would usually be some discussion about that, and other people sometimes would add to their list as well. And then we would hear from all of those small groups, and that's also a very interesting part of it. So the framework of personal, cultural, and institutional is a really helpful way for people to look at the biases, because we kind of know it's biased, but then we don't often look deeper to particularly the institutional, and we often just look at it from my experience of racism, rather than some of the cultural stereotypes or the huge institutional issues that are out there. So it's just helpful to look at that framework. Then hopefully that inspires people to think about a time that they've experienced bias against themselves. And this is really interesting because sometimes this is a great way to incorporate people that might be members of mostly power groups. And we don't always talk about the power groups at that moment in the workshop. But we make the comment, like, you may have experienced bias as a young person. You may have experienced bias as a person with a disability or an illness. You may have experienced bias because of ageism, because as a young person or an older person. So we ask people to think about a time that they experienced bias, and then they share that in a small group as well. And that's often a very, very meaningful part of the workshop. So the question is usually phrased, the time that I experienced bias against me. Okay, then we come back to the list of the isms, and we look at who's the power group and who's the non-power group. Okay, so we go back over the list. So in terms of racism, who's the power group? White people. Okay, and then yeah, so you're muted. And the non-power group are people of color, and then that, even right there, when we look at racism, we often forget other races of people. When we think of racism, we think of bias against African American people, but there's a kind of racism against Asian American people. And again, this is an American model that we've developed. It's a pluralistic model. I've done this in other countries where people are, kind of mostly of the same culture, and it's a very different discussion. They're not so much focused on racism necessarily, as we are in this country, in the United States. So we would really go through each ism and say who's the power group and the non-power group. So for sexism, obviously the power group is male, the non-power group is female. For sexual orientation, the power group would be heterosexual, and the non-power group would be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, any of the other new words that are being used. And then we would go over all of these, and then we would ask people to think about, in which way are you a member of a power group, and in which way are you a member of a non-power group. And then we have a whole thing that we do about what are behaviors of people in power groups. This was a theory, actually, that that was developed by a group called Visions. Has anyone ever heard of Visions? I really like their model, because they focus on how people in power groups behave and how people in non-power groups behave. So they would come up with a theoretical perspective on, so if you're a member of a non-power group, you might try to do things like blaming the system, or system beating, or avoiding contact with other people in the power group, or denying that there's really any difference, or a lack of political understanding of the significance of institutional racism or institutional sexism. Okay, so then we would go over and look at behaviors of people in power groups. So things like dysfunctionally rescuing, the example of when another person helps out another person to a point where they can't really act independently. And we might use the example of a person who is a woman who is in the construction work. And what do we think of when we see women construction workers? What are they usually doing? Waving the flag. That's what they're usually doing. They're not usually operating the heavy equipment, and they're not usually operating the hammers, and they're usually just standing there. So that's an example of the dysfunctionally rescuing, and then that leads to blaming the victims. So that leads to people saying, well, women aren't designed to do construction work anyway, and so after being dysfunctionally rescued, then they end up getting blamed. So blaming the victim is another behavior of people in power groups. And avoiding contact is also a behavior of both the power group and the non-power group, for different reasons. So a person in a non-power group might avoid contact out of embarrassment, but they have the choice, whereas a person in a non-power group, in a power group, has the choice, but the person in the non-power group might not have a choice of where they live, or it's a very different reason for avoiding contact. Denying difference is something that both people do, but again, for different reasons. And then also denying the political significance of racism or sexism or any of the other isms. So then we talk a little bit about internalized oppression and how this example of behaviors of power groups and behaviors of non-power groups, how does this relate to internalized oppression? Then we might do some small group work talking about in which way are you a member of a power group and in which member are you a member of a non-power group, and can you think of any examples that you've either observed for yourself or for other people that lead to internalized oppression? So, for instance, the non-power thing, the lack of understanding of the political implications of racism or sexism, that can lead to an internalized oppression that could lead to drug abuse or alcohol abuse or self-harming or even suicide because of the internalized oppression. And so that we might start talking about. And then we also will talk about hate crimes. And what groups do you think that the most hate crimes are directed against? What would you say?
I would guess people of color, African American.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
Yeah.
Most people don't think of that because it's an example really of this. We're so used to racism being everywhere that we don't even think of it as an oppression anymore because it's so in the society. So most people don't realize that the bulk of hate crimes are against people of color. Okay, and they by the way are mostly done by hate crimes, depending on how you define them, are often done by young men of color, not of color. Young white males are often the perpetrators of hate crimes. What other groups do you think there's a lot of hate crimes directed against?
Religious minorities.
Mm-hmm. For many years, religious bias was the second most common hate crime. That has actually changed. It's now the third most common. And what religious group do you think there are more hate crimes directed against?
I just finished reading a book about India, so I would say Muslims are targeted for hate crimes a lot.
Well, this is the hate crimes are actually recorded by the FBI. So again, this is an American model. So within the United States, one often would think that the religious bias hate crimes are predominantly done against Muslim Americans or from Islamophobia, but over the years, for the last 10 years, the largest hate crimes have been anti-Semitism.
Interesting.
Yeah, and again, people don't realize that. They often will think, oh, because of 9/11, it must have been anti-Muslim bias. But actually, after 9/11, there was more anti-Semitism that came up than there was anti-Muslim bias, at least in New York. And and the other thing is that anti-Semitism is now actually the third most common hate crime, but the type of hate crime with anti-Semitism is often related to property. Swastikas on the side of buildings and knocking over headstones and cemeteries. That sort of thing is often done within an anti-Semitic form of a hate crime. Mm-hmm. And then what do you think is the third most common hate crime?
I would guess LGBTQ.
Oh, you must have done some reading on this.
Yeah.
That actually is now the second most common.
Oh
And
man.
it has been for a couple of years. It used to be the third most common. And this happens. And what group within the LGBTQ community do you think there's most violence directed against?
I'm going to say,
Transgender.
yeah, transgender too.
Transgender is definitely on the rise, but it still is actually more violence directed against gay men. And that's when we start getting into the discussion of what's the interrelationship of homophobia and sexism. You know, and when you think of why gay bashing happens, and gay bashing is one of the most violent of the hate crimes, and it's often done by, again, young white males, not always, but the bulk of the hate crimes are done by young white males, and when you think of it, it's like, you know, you're not being a powerful male. So that's really, you know, at the root of the gay bashing. You're acting like a female. So that's the interrelationship of the sexism and the homophobia. So we would go over all of that, and I usually would go to the FBI statistics before the workshop and look and see how they've changed. You know, for instance, right after gay marriage came up, there was an increase in anti-gay hate crimes, and so, you know, there will be different events that will happen that will increase different groups being targeted. But I've always been very interested in hate crimes because it's such a reflection of what's going on in the society, and I always direct people to the FBI statistics, and it's not always accurate because not every state buys into it, and then there were different times when different hate crimes were not reported, you know. So then we will also talk about the relationship of bullying behavior and bias. And the CRC did quite a bit of work in Connecticut on bullying. And many states now have anti-bullying laws in place where they have to report any bullying incident. And in the state of Connecticut, those records are open. So having done a lot of work on bullying, I would always go to the school and ask, could I see what their bullying reports were? And virtually all of the bullying reports had to do with bias. They might have been anti-gay bias, they might have been anti-Semitic bias, they might have been sexist bias, you know, that, but they were all interrelated with bias. I mean, it could have been size or weight or, you know, clothing or you know, in that wider definition of bias. So just kind of looking at the interrelationship of bias and bullying and having a discussion about that was really, really important. And then at some point, actually probably a little earlier than what I'm talking about now, we would actually do some role playing on interrupting bias comments, on the assumption that if you know, what's going to happen if you don't interrupt a bias comment? It's going to increase. We kind of know this, that if you don't do something about it, it will escalate and get worse. So we brainstorm different ways of interrupting a bias comment or a bias situation, and you know, we're predominantly a school-based program, so we would be you know, setting an example of, you know, you're a teacher, or you're, you know, somebody working in a school, and you overhear a student making another a biased comment to another student, what would you do to interrupt it? And we would usually brainstorm types of biased comments that happen most often in their school. What do you think are the examples of the biased comments that happen in schools?
That's so gay.
That's so gay, definitely. Still going on, although less so, actually.
She's
What
a
else?
fat pig.
What?
She's a fat pig.
Yep. Weight issues is definitely up there. And
It's a hoe.
What was that?
Calling someone a hoe, or commenting on sexual activity.
Yeah, in some communities, that's something that's said a lot, and also I don't know if we still hear in schools people using the put down of what we call the R word, the retard, which is anti-special needs population. That's a really big one as well. And then we'll often usually the most common one is the "that's so gay" or the "no homo" expression. Where does everybody know what that means? The "no homo" is like if somebody, if it's usually two young men, if they make some positive comment to another young man, they might say something like, "Oh, no homo. I like your new jeans, but no homo," meaning I'm not really gay, but I'm going to say something positive about you, which is basically a homophobic, comment. And then when you unpack the "that's so gay" comment too, all these issues come up too, like, what do you mean by "that's so gay"? What I mean is that's really, that's really not so great, So you're saying that being gay is not so great, so you kind of unpack that whole discussion to a point where, young people will still say, "Well, I don't really mean anything by it." And then we will, ask, "Well, how would it feel if you had a cousin or you are gay yourself? What would that sound like if you're using 'that's so gay' as a negative term to mean that's so uncool or bad, whatever." So then we would pick one of those many put downs that we hear in schools, and we would do a role play practicing interrupting. And we might ask the question, what's a time that you successfully interrupted a biased comment? So I'll ask right now, can you think of a time when you successfully interrupted a biased comment? What technique did you use to do that? Anybody have a comment about that? Sometimes people will say that they said how they feel, and that. So then we'll start making a list of things that people did to successfully interrupt the biased comment. They might have made an I statement. They might have listened to the person and then paraphrased back what they said. They might have taken them off to the side and as a way of saving face and talk to them about how that made them feel, or why did they do that. They might give new information. They might use the model of listening, paraphrasing, and then suggesting an alternative. And then they would practice that, and then we would discuss what worked, and then people might come up with a different technique. And we would often talk about the issue of, if you're not sure what to do, how about just asking a question? Like if somebody makes a comment, what do you mean by that? And just keep asking the questions. And that's often a good way to, if you're not exactly sure what to do, or you're nervous about maybe putting down the other person yourself, to ask keep asking questions, just, for more clarity. And oftentimes that comes to the surface as to what, what the bias really was, and maybe why the person, even made the comment. So, and any thoughts on that so far?
It's so helpful. And I can think of examples where with kids, it seems easy to interrupt and redirect and ask the question, whatever. When a peer says something, I have to say that's much harder for me to own it and be in that moment and really call it out. Somebody makes a really bad racial joke or something, and you're like, that's really bad. I don't know. I don't even know how to respond. I'm much better at responding to kids than I am to.
Yeah. And often the reason for that is that you feel like you have more power in the situation, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And, but it's kind of the same thing though. And also if you say the same thing with a peer or family member.
Yes.
That often comes up in the discussion, how hard it is,
Yeah.
And when I first started doing this work, my main MO was to walk out of the room.
Yeah. Yes.
Which is definitely conflict avoiding. But also not wanting to do any more harm than was already done, That's why the asking of the questions, could you say more about that? And non-judgmental questioning from a conflict resolution perspective is really, really important. So we might practice asking, non-judgmental questions, or what do you mean by that? Or could you, of course that could be said in a tone that would be judgmental as well, but practicing ways of interrupting that you feel comfortable with in that situation.
I have this example that it still haunts me, and because it was I was working, I think I was in high school working as a file clerk in a doctor's office, and one of the doctors had just been hired, and he was newly hired. He was a young doctor, and as part of his paying off his debt, he needed to go to southern Texas to do, I guess, community work for poor Latina women. And anyway, he said something. He was complaining about the fact that he had to go do that, and he referred to the women. And I, excuse me for saying this word because it still haunts me. He referred to the women as beaners. I don't know if you ever heard that word, but that was a word, a real derogatory term that was used in California against Latino people. And I'll never, I can remember where I was standing. I remember where he was standing. I remember being so utterly shocked that these words came out of his mouth. And, I completely froze.
Yeah.
And to this day, he subsequently, died of cancer, unfortunately, years later. But to this day, that haunts me, of just the overpowering inertia that can occur when you just are so shocked by what comes out of someone's mouth, and that, you completely wimp out in that moment. And even sometimes later, now I can say, okay, well, there's a power differential, blah, blah, blah. But just at that very human level, I'll never forget just the shock and the complete way I froze. And I was a pretty outspoken, person against racism in those days, and I, if anyone should have spoken, it would have been me. And the fact that I couldn't, my voice really frustrated me.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's a really good example of how, if we don't do something about it, a little part of us dies. The fact that you remember that now through all these years, and in fact, I'm reminded of a participant who she was a child when she remembered this. Actually, she was a Jewish woman who basically was in a group of people that did not know she was Jewish, and the children made an anti-Semitic comment, and she didn't step up and say, "Oh, I'm Jewish," or that makes me feel really bad, I'm Jewish, or whatever. She didn't interrupt it. She didn't say anything. And this was 30 years prior, and she still was so upset about not having done anything about it. It was really painful for her, you know, and that's such a good example of an internalized depression, and how if we don't interrupt the bias, we harm ourselves as well as other people, you know.
Yeah.
And you know, the injustice of allowing it to happen, a little bit of us just dies, you know, from that. And your example is a perfect example of that. Yeah, so this is exactly the kind of discussion that we have in our workshops, and it usually I often do try to mention. Does everyone know who Elie Wiesel is, or was? He was a Holocaust survivor, and he would often make the point that people who do hate crimes are often doing this out of a sense of moral correctness, you know, and that you know, this is what I morally believe. So having that discussion of the value, people having really big value differences, and when people have a value difference that leads to a hate crime, that's when laws need to come into effect, really, to protect people. So I usually try to mention that because I think he had such a great understanding of bias from an anti-Semitism perspective. But it also, you know, from a conflict resolution perspective, people who, you know, are anti-gay or anti-Jewish or anti-Muslim or anti whatever the other isms are, it often boils down to a value difference. So we're not necessarily going to change that person's mind, but we we can you know, agree to disagree and point out how it makes us feel, you know. So that's when it comes back to the conflict resolution. Then we usually end the workshop by asking, what can we do to make our communities, our classrooms, our schools, or could be a community, it could be a family, safer and more welcoming for everybody involved. And then we make a list of that, and we usually close by saying one thing I'm going to do. So that's kind of the model. And I can't believe we're almost out of time here already, but there's a lot more to say about it, but it's very interesting and important work, I think. Oh, okay. Bye, Karen. Yeah, we're out of time. Actually.
Thank you, though. Thank you so much. I've taken like 5 pages of notes. This is really, really, really great. I appreciate your wisdom and sharing all of this with us. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Good to see you. I wish I could stay longer, but I'll see
you at ACR.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you so much. I took notes as well. This is great work, and it was really, I could totally see this working in so many settings. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Well, Pris, thank you so much. And again, for our audience who is watching this by video, Pris, would you like to share your contact information in case someone would like to talk to you about training possibilities or wants your untapped knowledge?
Oh, sure. Our website is crc-global.org. That's crc-global.org. Our phone number is 845-353-1796. And my email address is prutzman@crc-global.org. Thank you so much, Cindy, for this opportunity.
Oh, gosh. Thank you, Pris. I'm going to stop recording.